Okay. Whoa, it's loud. Is this a bit loud or is this good? Good? Okay. So I'm going to just start off by asking you, let's say this right here, that we have a separate HTTP request for JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and for every single image included in this document. How many HTTP requests do you think we have on this page? Well, there's got to be at least 2. We have CSS and we have HTML. There are no images imported into this page. There's no JavaScript to render this page. So we're going to learn how to render this page. Name of the talk is Making It Snow Without JavaScript. That's how you knew there was no JavaScript. There is JavaScript, of course, on the slide deck. Just a bit about me. My name is Estelle Weyl. If you're bored, really deep, in-depth tutorials on stuff you might not come across, but if you ever don't know what background clip property is, how well it's supported in different browsers, Standardista will put you to sleep, but it's a really good resource. And follow me on Twitter, because I'm a Twitter whore. And these are some of my books. These 2 have come out. I'm a co-author, or wrote a chapter in this. And these 2 will be coming out early next year. Or early next year, late next year. OK, so these are the features in this deck. I'll just make it round again. We have CSS selectors, because we are telling, there's actually no classes either. All of these list items are just called li. There are no list items. So we have CSS selectors to say which ones should be big, which ones should be small, which ones should be fast, which ones should be slow. We have linear gradients. Can anyone name 3 linear gradients on this page? The sky going from blue to white. Anyone see any other gradients? The snow are done with linear gradients. The snowman is just a div called snowman with a gradient, round gradient for 3 round gradients as a background images, 2 linear gradients for each arm, round gradients for the nose, and generated content for the triangle of the nose. So let's learn how we do this. The first thing we do is, the first thing I'm going to teach you, it's not the first thing that I did when I was doing this deck. The first thing that I'm going to show you about is CSS selectors. Because what happens if you look at the code of this page, there's just 27 eyes, open eye, close eye, and each eye is a snowflake. So I put a gradient as a background image on those and then told them to go from top to bottom. But then I had to tell them which ones to go fast and which ones to go slow. So I use structural selectors. And here are our structural selectors. We have nth child, nth last of type. I'm going to show you a little bit through here. This is an easier way of explaining it. So one of the structural selectors we have is first child, last child, and only child. We also have first of type, last of type, and only of type. And so in this first line, we said first child and last child, make it bold. And if you see here, these 2 are bold. So what that does is it says, in the parent element, the first child that is a tr, well, if the first child is a tr, which in a table it always is, it's actually on the first child of the t-body, not the table itself. And the tr is also the last child, because you can't have any other element that is the child of a t-body. So we made those bold. We also said first of type and last of type. So the difference between first child and first of type is the first child, it has to actually be the first child of its parent. First of type has to be first of its type, but it doesn't need to be the first child's. So in the HTML document, the body is always the first of its type, but it's never the first child. The body is always the last child, because the head is the first child. Does that make sense to people? OK. So then we have nth child even. So when we had first child and last child and first of type and last of type, it was basically, it's as if we put nth child 1 or nth child last in there. But we also have 2 key terms we can put in there, even and odd. So in this case, nth child even, make the background color gray, and I assume you can see the color difference, but 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 are gray. And odd, background color is white. So same thing. Odd and even are key terms for 2n and 2n plus 1. So odd is 2n plus 1, even is 2n, which is an equation. So we have this variable n, and we can put whatever we want as an iterator, and then an offset. So what this says is every third one, starting with 1 from the first third. So we first replace n as if it was 0. So 3 times 0 is 1, so negative 1 doesn't count. Then we say n1. So 3 minus 1 is 2. So this would be number 2, 5, 8 would be italic. And because of the font I use, this isn't really noticeable, but 2, 5, and 8 are actually italic. We don't need to have an offset. Here it says 4n, so that means number 4, 8, 12. Number 4, number 8, and number 12, if there was one, would be pink. Does that make sense for structural selectors? So what I did is I said, this is the actual code for the snowflakes. Let me just restart the snowflakes. All it is a bunch of i's. And I said nth of type 5n, make it big. 5n plus 1, so the 6th, the 11th, and the 1st, make it a little bit smaller. 5n plus 2, make it tiny. I basically used odd prime numbers so that it wouldn't repeat. So 3n plus 1, 3n plus 2, I gave it different delays so that they would start at different times. I'll talk about delay later on, so if this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. Different opacities, so every 7th, 14, 21st would be 50% opaque. Every 1st, 8th, 15th, I can count, would be more opaque. Does that make sense to people? So basically I use structural selectors to add styles. So I didn't add any classes, but I targeted the elements that way. You can target any element on your page with selectors. If there's way more selectors, I'm not going all over. Not going to go over them all, but if you want to learn all of it, okay. So this talk is at estelle.github.com/snow. If you want to learn about selectors, I'm just going to show you my GitHub page. So, hard to read, but these are all my tutorials and workshops. And way at the top, there's a presentation called, I can't even read my own screen, so I don't know how you can. Right there it says selectors, and it's all about selectors, and it goes over all of these. So if you want to learn more about selectors, look at this deck later on. Okay. So here are some more selectors. We're not going to cover any of these, but just know you can actually generate content. The nose on the snowflake, on the snowman, if you want to make a triangle in CSS, you basically say, this box has a height of 0, and then you know how when you do borders, it makes triangles? So you just say 3 of them are transparent, and the 4th one has color. So I did that with generated content. So on my snowman, I just put a little triangle that way and put it in the middle of the face. Because we have HTML5 web forms, you can actually have enabled, disabled, checkboxes can be checked, input types can be valid or invalid, optional and required. These are many different things that you can do now with selectors. And I'm going to cover these 3. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to cover them anyways. Does anyone know what the greater than sign means? It says right there, child. So normally we do like ULLI, and that means an LI that is the descendant of UL. But the LI might be inside of an OL. If you put this here, it means it has to be the direct child. Not any descendant, but the direct child. E plus F is the adjacent sibling. So it'll match letter E, or find whatever class E is, and then we'll find F that is only if f is directly after it with the same parent. So if like your fourth li, if you do nth of type 4 plus li, it will only be the fifth one. And tilde, similarly, it'll find the element that you matched with like nth of type, li nth of type 4. Tilde li would match the fifth, sixth, seventh, and so on. So that's any sibling that comes after it. So those are the selectors I wanted to cover. Talked about generated content. I mentioned the nose. I'm going to be using generated content in this slide a lot. Whenever I show you something transitioning, I'm going to have a box, and then there's going to be a box down here. That generated box is done with generated content. So when you do generated content, you can create an element. The only thing that you need to use to include is the content property. And you can make that an empty string if you want to. If you say position absolute, top 0, bottom 0, left 0, right 0, it'll grow to take up the exact same size of its parent. So that's a neat little trick. But I wasn't going to cover generated content, so if you're interested, here's tutorials. What I did want to cover today mostly is animation and gradients. So the first gradient is the background gradient. It goes from top to bottom. This is 3 ways of writing it, and this is supported in every browser. It is supported in every browser with a prefix. They have changed the syntax. The syntax is very similar, but it's only supported in Firefox. So I'm going to talk about this one because it's supported everywhere. So what this says is background image, linear gradient, go from dark blue to light blue. And that's what it does. It starts at the top, goes to the bottom. And that's the default from top to bottom. You could have used the key term top and a color stop. You could have said 0% to 100%. This is the exact same thing as that because these are the default values. Top, 0, and 100% are the default values. And top is also equal to 270. So this is what is supported right now in all browsers. If you still want to target Android 2.4 or lower, there's actually a different syntax. The resource has that syntax, and I have another talk called Gradients, which covers that. So if you want to go way deep and dive into gradients, but I want to do a quick overview so that you understand them. The difference between the old syntax and the new syntax is the future one that isn't yet supported, is it's not going to be prefixed. So right now, you want to do this. You want to put WebKit linear gradient, WebKit linear gradient, and WebKit linear gradient right there. Without the syntax, when supported, this comma should work. Nope. Refreshing the page does work. Brings back the snow, though. So the new syntax, you put the keyword here, to. It would say to top. Yep. And you would actually want to write to bottom. Whoop, typo. So this is the new syntax. If you're going to have it unprefixed, you say to direction. So instead of the from, it's the to. And instead of going clockwise or counterclockwise, it goes clockwise. Otherwise, it's the same thing. So it's pretty easy to understand. So let's go on with gradients. This is the snowflake. You see these snowflakes? They have rounded borders, but they basically look like this. There's a line going down, line going across, and 2 diagonal lines. Gradients go from one color to the next color over space. But if you say that at 40% you go from fully transparent to full white, at 40%, there's going to be a hard line right there. So what's happening is this gradient that has the arrow, it's going from transparent here all the way to here, and then there's a color stop that still says transparent at the 40% mark. And at the 40% mark, there's another color stop that says solid white. and continues on solid white to 60%, and then at 60% I say solid white, and then at 60% I say transparent again. So 90 degrees, fully transparent at 40, fully opaque at 40. From 40 to 60 it's going to be solid white, and from 60 to, after 60, because right there at exactly 60%, it goes with fully transparent. Anyone know why I chose to say 255, 255, 255, 0 instead of transparent? Does anyone know what color transparent is? Transparent is actually black. So if you go from one color to another, from fully opaque to the key term transparent, it'll actually go through the grays. So if I'd gone from 60 to 61, there would have been a gray line there, and it would have looked weird. So that's gradients with hard stops. And I'm just going to show you the gradients deck. If you are interested, I like to make ugly things, but these are all gradients. And this is radial gradients. You can really do, you can make people sick. But there's the whole, this is what the wallpaper looked like when I first moved into my house, except for it was green. It looks something like this. And when you would hang out in my house, it kind of did this, because it was so ugly. But if you want the gradients talk and to dive into gradients, you can go there. But just to give you a little bit more on gradients, we can change the angle. You see that? If you make the first stop equal to the next stop, make these two equal. You see how there's that hard stop right there? That's because these two values are equal. Does anyone have questions on gradients before I move on? Okay, so to summarize with gradients, we want to still prefix all of them. Transparent is black, so it will fade to gray. You can create hard effects by putting color stops in the exact same location. If you see here and here, I created these by putting multiple background images. You can use gradients any place where you could where you would use URL parentheses, right? So you could use them for list items. You can use them for border image. You can use them for background image. And like background image, you can put multiple ones. Other than IE 8, 7, 6, and 5, you can use multiple background images. And here's some resources and ideas on gradients. Okay. Want to cover opacity. There are 5 snowflakes on this page. You can't see the last one because opacity is set to 0. So sometimes you're using opacity when you really should be using an RGBA color, because opacity is the opacity of the full element. So it made sense for me to use it on my snowflakes because my snowflakes don't have text in it. But if you're going to make a background color change the opacity on the background of something, you'll want to use the RGBA color on the background as a background color instead of opacity, because you're not only going to disappear the box background, you're going to disappear the whole element. So that's opacity. And just to explain a little bit what I meant, this is alpha transparency. So the background color went from blue to fully transparent blue, but you can still see what was behind it. And here, the text also went from full black to fully transparent. But look, you can still see, I can see it, I don't know if you can see it back there, but the shadow that was on my text is still there. So when you make your colors, your font color transparent, the shadow's still there. Does anyone have any questions on alpha transparency? I used opacity for my snowflakes just because there was no text in it. Had there been text in it, I would have used alpha transparency for the background color. Actually, I used alpha transparency fully opaque and somewhat opaque for the original definition, and then I said nth of type 3 plus 1, opacity 0.4, whatever. That was because the snowflakes, it's okay if they go light. So use opacity to hide and show divs till they're invisible. But but otherwise use RGBA or HSLA colors. So when I mean HSLA, anyone, is this familiar to people? Is this not familiar to people? Okay. So if you use Photoshop, which I do not use Photoshop, there's hue, brightness, and saturation. Okay. So hue is it's basically on the color wheel. It goes from 0 to 360. 0 is red, 360 is red. So if I change the hue, 0 is red. It goes through orange, yellow, green, turquoise, blue, fuchsia, and then back to red. So the color, the first value is hue. And if you use Photoshop, this might make sense to you. For me, RGB makes way more sense. But for your designers, they might give you the colors in this way, or they might give you the Photoshop file, and you're like, you don't have to color pick anymore. You can just do that. Saturation goes from fully saturated color to complete lack of color. So 0 to 100%, 100% being the brightest. Lightness adds light or removes light. And then you have alpha transparency that does that. If you want a color picker, there's a few different ways to do color pickers. If I opened up and I select this right here, and here it says RGBA 255. You see that? RGBA right there. But I told it to be HSLA, right? You can, now in Chrome, wait. Now in Chrome you can do this, and it gives you this, which is odd. I never saw this before. This wasn't here when I did this, when I was looking at this 3 days ago, so I updated my Chrome. But another thing you can do is here, you can say, please give me the colors in hex, RGB, or HSL. This is a way of doing it when you actually have the site open. But if you want to, if you go to my GitHub repo, there's an HSL to RGB to hexadecimal converter, so you can use that. Okay, just to give you a few more tips on this, a few alpha transparency tips. When you're doing box shadows and when you are doing text shadows, use alpha transparency. Because you see this, you can see the lines right through it. That looks much more natural. Here, you can see the border, the background coming through. That looks more like a shadow. If you use solid colors, it kind of looks like you're doing an outline. So if you want to do an outline, fine. Use solid shades with RGB colors, right? But if you want it to look more natural and to be more pleasing, use RGBA or HSLA, whatever. Use some type of alpha transparency. So let's move on to border radius. Our snowflakes were round. Border radius 0, default value is a square. If you are ever going to transition a circle, like a thing, make it go like this, from square to round to square to round, you have to declare border radius as 0 in your pre-state. You can't transform from a non-declared to a declared in some browsers. So that's a note that has nothing to do with the slide deck, but I hit it the other day. So border radius, you can also give it an exact length. Here we have 20 pixels. And here we have 50%, which makes a circle. We could have done 25%, whatever. This works well if you are doing the same size corners on every element on your page. This looks better if you're doing designs, because you don't know what your element's going to be. Do whatever you need. So we can create a circle, border radius 50% when the height and the width is the same, or an oval when the width is twice as big as the height. When you want to do different, you see here border radius 10 pixels, 30 pixels. Without the slash, this one, if you look at the bottom one, exact same, except for there's a slash. So what does a slash mean? When you say 20 pixels, 30 pixels, it means make this corner the first value, this is second value, this is either the third value or the first value, depending on how many values you had. Kind of like when you're doing border radius and you have 4 values. But both corners will be the exact same radius. So this is 10 pixels, and 10 pixels. This is 30 pixels and 30 pixels, 10, 10. This one says make the horizontal 10 pixels and the vertical 30 pixels. Does that make sense to people? What that slash means? Okay, so I talked a little bit about transforms, but I'm going to dive into transforms now. So remember when I said generated content? This box is actually generated content on top of that box. And it's the exact same height and width because I used after content 0, position absolute, top 0, bottom 0, right 0, left 0. So it grew to take up its parent shape, right? So what I've done is I've translated it. Translate is a transform, and it means move it from the left and from the top. So I moved it negative 80 pixels from the left, so that's this way. Positive would have been that way. And 200 pixels from the top. Then I said rotate it 15 degrees. Now when you use rotate without an X or Y, it rotates this way. If you say rotate X, it rotates this way. So 180, you'd actually see the backhand side. If you see rotate Y, it goes that way. Scale, 2 values, X, Y. It's 1.5 times as wide and twice as tall. And then skew takes it and goes like that. So actually, if I had written these 4 in a row, does anyone know what would have happened? What happens with the Css Cascade when you use the exact same property? This would have only been transformed. It would have only been skewed, because these would have overwritten. So when you use multiple, you do transform, translate, and you separate all of those, and that's how I actually did that. So because I didn't show it in action, I'm going to show it in action. So I'm going to translate the first one by 200 pixels, and it goes off the page. I'm going to rotate this one by 365 degrees, and I rotate it back. There's also a, whenever I hover over anything in this deck, it grows bigger. So that's, I'm going to scale this one. See, it's bigger. And this is, I'm going to explain to you. Transform origin. When I spun it here, it's spun around its center. But that would be boring. So I said transform origin, negative 20 pixels, negative 20 pixels. So here's the upper left-hand corner of this div, right, of this element. 20 pixels to the left and 20 pixels to the top. There's going to be a pink point right here when I hover over it, and it's going to rotate around that pink dot. See that? So it's rotating around something instead of its center. It's rotating around. So basically, let's say this is the rotation point. It would rotate like that. Okay. So when it comes to transforms, we are still prefixing them. Take advantage of transform origin. Space separate them, because when we learn transitions, we're going to be using a comma. So that's the difference between transitions and transforms. Transforms is space separated. One of the things to note is 3D transforms are hardware accelerated. So if you want to force something to be hardware accelerated on a device that supports hardware acceleration, you can do translate Z, 0. It does nothing other than put it into the GPU and out of the CPU. So that is really, really awesome because GPU works, performs much better than CPU. The only thing is it uses up a bit more memory. So it's not like, don't do a zoom one. You know, like with IE6, you're just like zoom one everything because everything, that way nothing will break. Don't do a star translate 3D because you'll be putting everything on, you'll be basically using up all your memory. But on a mobile device I'm talking about. But the other thing that 3D does is it, and all the transforms do, it has its own stacking index, but the 3D index is higher than anything on the page. So you cannot actually put anything on top of something that's translated 3D. Its children will be on top of it. So let's say you have a leaf going like this down your page. I don't know why you do that. Like if you have a snowflake, if if I 3D transform my snowflakes, I could never put anything on top of my snowflakes. The snowflakes would come on top of everything else. So just note that. Here's a transform tool that you can play with to learn more about it. Matrix is a syntax that I did not cover, but if you see matrix in the code, it is simply a computer language type way of transitioning, or transforming rather. And basically it's computer generated, so that's what it means. Like, I'm not going to cover it because you're not going to learn it from me because I don't fully understand it, but you'll see it, so I want you to understand the code. And if you want to read a more in-depth article, there's an article on my blog, and also I have a slide, a whole presentation on it, so you can go to that too. I show you how to transform airplanes, because airplanes are fun. Okay, so transitioning. Who here has ever done a transition? Who here has ever made a link change a color? Oh, seriously, come on, everyone, wake up. Okay, everyone is transition, because when you make a link go from red to blue on hover, you're transitioning it from red to blue, but over 0 seconds. So you can actually, you can now control these transitions and say, you know what, when you go from red to blue, take 1 second, and first wait 0.5 seconds to make sure that the user wants to do that. So we have the transition property, which is the property that we're going to transition, or we have the key term all, which means transition everything. We have a transition duration in seconds or milliseconds, which means how long should this transition take. We have a transition timing function, which I will cover when I do animation, because it's the exact same values. But basically, it's a Bezier curve of should you go slower and then faster, or faster than slower, or go in steps. Transition delay is how long should I wait before I start the transition. And then you just have the transition shorthand, because if you were to put these prefix for all of these, that would be a lot of code. So this is a transition. In the pre-state, I give it a color, a font size, and a background color, 40% opaque. And then I say transition all in a half a second. And then on hover, notice that this is in the pre-state. It's in the pre-state because this way, if I change class, it will also transition. If it was just in hover, it would have to be in the hover to transition. I'm going to transition the color, the font size, and the background color. Woo, how exciting is that? I could have also written color, font size, background color, notice the commas, instead of using the key term all. Now the reason that this looks like crap, when I do this, you see how it's jumpy? Is because I am reflowing the page. The font size is changing the height of my element, so I have to reflow everything. So this would have been much better if I'd animated a scale. Scale from 0 to, or from 1 to 1.2. So realize sometimes if you're going to reflow the page, because you're going to change the size of something, it has to do it 60 times a second. It gets janky. Okay, so now let's learn how to animate. So these are the properties we're going to learn. The first thing we're going to learn is keyframes. So when you have an animation, you actually have an animation that you can reuse. You create an animation, you go from top to bottom, and then you have to attach it to an element. So the first step is to create an animation, a reusable animation. So you give it a name, not quoted, and then you can either say from and to, or 0% to 100%. So my snowflakes are going from negative 40 pixels from the top to 1,000 pixels from the top. And that's actually not what they're doing. They're going like only 600, because that's the height of my slide. But that's the general idea. Don't forget the percent. This is called a keyframe. You can have many of them. In fact, here we have 4. And when I hover over this, it says at 0% of the time, basically at the beginning, start at negative 40 pixels from the top. 10% into the animation, you should have gone 400 pixels. 90% of the animation time, you should have gone 560 pixels. So we're going to spend 80% of the time going 160 pixels. And we're going to spend 20 of the time going the rest. And that's why it's slowing down in the middle. Does that make sense? Okay. So here I've only animated top. You can also animate multiple properties. So here it's falling. Same thing. Top negative 40, top 800. Opacity is going from 1 to 50% and back to 1. So top, I declared it here and here, because basically I don't care what it does here. Whereas opacity, I want to do those steps. So you can animate multiple properties, and you don't have to set them in each one. So I don't have this on the slide deck, but I'll explain it. What can you transition and animate? You can transition and animate anything where you could find a 50% midpoint on something. So font size 100% to font size 120, the midpoint was 110. Scale 0 to scale 1, mid-size is scale 0.5. Display block to display none, what's the midpoint? There is none. So you can't transition. The only value that doesn't have a midpoint that you can transition is actually visibility. And what happens is it stays visible, and right at the 100% it becomes display hidden. So height auto to height 1000 does not work. But min height 0 to min height 1000 would be a good alternative, because you know it's not going to be 1,000 pixels high. And you know min height, it'll be at least as tall as it needs to be. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So let's continue with our keyframes. We can also repeat keyframes. So this stops on the end, goes to the other end and stops, goes back. So from 0 to 30%, it's hanging out over there. From 50 to 80%, it's hanging out over here. Or the other way around, rather. And then it's actually moving from 80 to 100%, and from 30 to 50%. So you see, you can reuse them by putting a comma. So here, I have reused the same keyframe definitions, but I have not reused the keyframe, like kind of like the property, or the selector, the time selector, percent selector. You cannot reuse the percent selectors. They will overwrite whatever. It's not like they'll say, oh, you put property of left here, and you put property of top here. You cannot reuse, you can't reuse a keyframe selector. Does that make sense to people? Like I couldn't have said, I couldn't have put a 0% down here. Ugh. Because this, for 0%, would not have listened to that. It would have just listened to this, even though they're not repeating the same properties. Okay. So we were supposed to be prefixing them all, just so you know. Animating CSS transforms. I'm basically doing the exact same thing I was doing before, except for it actually goes smoother now. When you animate top to bottom, it was positioned absolutely, so it's only reflowing that one element, so it's not that bad performance-wise. But transforming it takes it out of where it was, takes it and puts it in its own context, so it actually always performs better. Vendor prefix it all here. WebKit, this is prefixed, and our transforms are prefixed. Okay. And then with transform origin, this is actually what made the snowflakes look so nice, was my transform origin. So here I put a transform origin here of left and negative 20 pixels. So it's actually going like this, you know, like that. So when it's here, you can see it go like that, but when it's dropping from the top, if you follow any one of these snowflakes, this one, you see it doesn't go in a straight line. You see how it's going over this, that? That's just to make it look more natural. So what we've done right here is we've told the snowflake to use a transform origin, but we haven't told it to use a frame, an animation yet. Nothing is animated so far. So what we do, this is the basis of our snowflake, told it how to look, and then gave it a transform origin. And then we attached the animation name. Two properties are required on your element for there to be an animation. The name of your animation and the duration, because otherwise the duration is 0 and nothing gets animated. So here it takes 3 seconds, but you can also make it really fast. Oop, that's really fast. And you can make it really slow. Okay, that's enough for that one. Then we have animation timing function. And basically, we have all of these as choices. We have ease, which it's the default, and it goes slower to faster. Linear, which is all the same speed all the way across. Ease in goes slower and faster like ease. Ease out goes faster than slower. Ease in out goes slower, faster, then slower again. And then step is kind of interesting, and no one knows this one, but it actually says, instead of going smoothly, just jump at steps where you would be at these certain points. So if I tell it to step 5 times, it's going to jump. If you want to learn more about cubic Bezier curves, like all of these to here are actually cubic Bezier curves. You can actually, if you know physics or calculus or differential equations, or more than I do, you can actually write your own cubic Bezier curve. And there's a cool site called cubic-bezier.com where you can actually compare two Bezier curves. Oops, I'm not going to. I was going to show you that link, but I'm not going to bother. Animation iteration count is how many times. So here we have been doing 3 times or once. Animation iteration count 3. The default is 1. The main thing to know is that if you spell this correctly and write infinite, like I did up there, usually people do it once or infinite times. Very rarely do you do 3. The snowflakes, on the other hand, I did 27 iterations of some, 32 of others, and like 24 of others. Why? Because the snowflakes coming down, are you guys sick of them yet? They get really annoying really fast. So I stopped the animation after 3 minutes. But I don't stop all of them at the same time. Some go fast, some go slow. So iteration count was another one of those things that I tried to average it out to about 3 minutes of animation, or maybe 2 minutes, I can't remember, by giving a certain number, a count. So animation delay is how long you should wait before you start the animation. And there's a few important things to note about animation delay. When you're doing transition delay, it's very important. Ever go like across a browser and it just starts popping open as you go across them? Put a transition delay of 50 milliseconds, because that way someone can swipe across your page without accidentally hitting and popping something open. Animation delay is another thing to note. It has to do with performance. The browser is single-threaded, so your JavaScript, your reflow, your repaints, and your animation are all in the same UI thread. Animations have the lowest priority on that thread. So once an animation starts, it will continue to go. Don't worry about that. But what happens is, let's say your page is taking 8 seconds to load. In your page, you've declared that I want an animation delay of 2 seconds on one element, 4 seconds on another, 6 on another. Your animation delay has expired, but the animations have not started because animating is the lowest on the priority thread. So what happens is your browser remembers, we've already gone through 8 seconds, so start everything that has less of an 8-second delay. So on these snowflakes, if you really had if there was tons of JavaScript in this page, which there isn't, but if there were, your first 27 snowflakes would all drop at the same time, even though there were delays on some of them. Okay, another cool thing about animation delay is a negative animation delay. So here, here it's a okay, I'm going to put it at negative 2.1. I'm going to go off the slide. I have to wait for it to go 3 times. Okay, when I go off the slide, nothing happens. But when I go on, it should start 2/3 of the way down. Yeah, you see how that did that? So a negative value means, basically in this case, start 2/3 of the way through. If this was a 10-second delay, and I put 5 seconds, it would have started 50% of the way through. So this is one good way if you want to start like a seesaw, and you want to start one animation down here at the end, and go like that. You just delay one by a full full duration. Does that make sense to people? Any questions on that? Okay. Okay, direction. Everything so far has gone from top to bottom. It doesn't have to. We can make our snowflakes alternate. And now we are going to have snowflakes floating up our page. So what animation direction does, it has two possible values, normal, which is the default, and alternate. When you put normal, it goes from 0% to 100% keyframe, and then it jumps back to 0 and goes back to 100%. When you put alternate, it goes from 0 to 100%, 100% back to 0. And then, fortunately, we have the shorthand. So what we've done so far is animation name falling, duration 3 seconds, timing function ease out, iteration count infinite, delay 2 seconds, and animation direction normal, which I've crossed out since it's the default. I didn't have to put it in. And I just created these shorthands. In terms of what happens at animation end, every single animation so far, every slide has started with this being gray, and then it's turned to pink and changed to blue as it's gone down the page. Have you guys noticed that? That's because this has it has the animation attached to it, but it has not gone through the delay. So what happens is, when you load the page, your animation gets attached and says, oh, after the delay, I'm going to start with the 0% keyframe. But what you can do is you can tell it, when I load the page, start at the 0% keyframe and hang out on that 0% keyframe throughout the entire delay. So for 5 seconds, it will hang out at the top of the page and be pink, if I'm lucky. Oh, no, it won't, because I didn't hit forwards. I would have to hit backwards for that to happen. Now I have to wait for it to go through 3 times. And then when it's done, that's forwards, actually. Okay. Well, this slide does not work. So let me see what the next one does. Okay, animation fill mode's backwards. See how it's pink? It's gone to the 0% keyframe. For 5 seconds, it's going to hang out there being pink, and then it's going to start. Oh, I'm already on it. I've already hovered over it. And then it goes 3 times, and then it jumps back to being gray, because I didn't tell it at the end to do anything. That would be both or forwards. So here, these two don't do anything at the back, but these two, where it says backwards and both, started at the 0%. It hung out at the 0 throughout the delay. And then both and forwards at the end stayed 100%. Do the values of backwards, forwards, both, and none make sense to people? Both means at the beginning, before your animation starts, while you're going through the delay, go to the 0% and hang out there. And then after the animation is done, until you reload the page or remove that animation name from that element, make it stay at the 100% keyframe. Can you stop an animation? Obviously you can, because we've been doing it throughout this deck. What I've been doing is those animations have started when I hover over the slide. So here we have this little game where we catch the snowflake. So here I do animation place state paused on hover. So you can actually stop an animation. You can also, there's actually an API with this, or event rather. You can have event listeners on animation start, animation end, and animation iteration. Thing to note though, animation start and animation end iterate happen every single time there's an animation. So if you do infinite, you have an infinite number of times that this is happening. So these two really work well when you're only doing one time. And animation iteration is when you're doing something over and over again. So, you know, here I did add event listener webkit animation end, console log animation ended. Whoop-de-doo. This is actually more relevant. Add event listener animation end, do whatever you need to do, remove the class, and then after 100 milliseconds put it back on. Why? Because if I remove it and put it back on right away, it won't know that it was ever removed, and it won't do whatever I wanted it to do. So why are we talking about animation at a JavaScript conference? Because this is all doable without the weight of a JavaScript library. And so people have been using jQuery to slowly open up navbars, right? So when you're doing JavaScript and you're animating, you're using up your UI thread. When you're doing this, you're not using up the UI thread. This goes into the UI thread line, right? They're all nicely waiting in line. This gets pushed to the back of the line when when other stuff is happening, when you're downloading, parsing, and executing your JavaScript. But once it starts, it just keeps going, and it's using the power of the CPU or the GPU without basically burdening the UI thread. This, it depends on the device. On my old Mac, I used to use this page to keep myself warm, because it does use a lot of CPU. But this is the default browser behavior. This is what the browsers are now expecting to see, and they're becoming more and more performant. So the battery is going to actually do much better, especially if you put this into a 3D space and you have the GPU take care of it. So, you know, JavaScript is not to be... You want to have the separation of concerns, and animation is definitely a presentational feature. It is not a behavioral feature. Having snowflakes come down your page belongs to the CSS. It's presentation. It is not behavior. And it's not content either. So use CSS instead of JavaScript whenever you can. And that's kind of it for my presentation. I tried going fast. I'm not sure how much time I have left. Am I 10 minutes over? Anyone know? I have 10 minutes. Awesome. So I blew through some of that stuff, and I spoke really fast like Americans do. But does anyone have any questions? We've covered, let me just go back to the original slide. I think I should just refresh the page instead of giving everyone epileptic seizures. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, we're going to have oh, you have a question, because otherwise we'd have a test. Yeah. Okay. So the question was, do we only have hover? No, I only put I only change the property and value on hover because it's easy to show in a slide deck. But you can change the class of an element, and you can change the class of an element no matter how you want to change it. So you can use, like, the slides go left to right, right? I could start an animation every time I change the class name. Because I would just say .foo, animation paused. So any place where you do it in CSS, you can actually do it in JavaScript too. When you do a class name, when you do a transition, when you have an UI change of some sort, so you can only do the pause when you have something that throws it from one property value, from one selector to another selector. So I could do it if, this is using selectors, but if I do input bracket checkbox, so an input that is a checkbox, colon checked, in the check state, plus snowflake pause. You know, I could do it that way. So when I check and uncheck the checkbox, I could make it run. That's a convoluted example, but it would work. And actually, I would use tilde instead of plus, because that would be only one snowflake. So you could actually, I could actually have put a little checkbox in the upper right-hand corner and run them that way. Because if you look here, right here, I could have put, I can't put spaces, unfortunately, because it moves forward. I need to reprogram this deck. Input type equals checkbox. Right? And then in here, if I had done it would be tilde. Okay, so right here, this says input of type checkbox. When it's checked, all the snowflakes that are after that input, which would include all of these because they have the same parent. And so I could have told them to pause that way. That's convoluted, but it's completely doable. And any browser that supports animation supports that selector, because IE9 and above, and all of the other browsers since forever, support this right here. And actually, IE7 supports this, it just doesn't support that. And IE7 supports this, but not that. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? You had a second question. Yeah. Okay. The question was, what is more performant, basically, gradients or using spacer GIF, right? So if it's a 1-pixel image, it's 1 pixel, so you can do a background with just color. Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about in this room right now with the crappy DSL that we have, you don't want to do the extra HTTP request, right? But 1-pixel image, maybe not. 10-pixel image, so, you know, you could also do a data URI for your 1-pixel image. Or you could do a background color, because it's only 1 pixel. That would be a background color. Let me just go into my gradients talk and show you what an issue is. Oh, actually, let me go into a different talk, since we're talking about performance. This talk, it says mobile, don't break the web. It's all about performance. It is the least performant page I've ever done in my entire life. But let me just go to the end. Okay. This is a radial gradient right here. I just wanted a little curve on this web page, and in fact, it was, when I wanted to do this originally, it was just a little curve up here. So I decided to do a radial gradient because I'm like, that way I don't have to make images, because I hate making images. This is what the browser does. It draws this as a radial gradient. So radial gradients, if they're small and they end, they're fine. If they're big, this is bigger than 1024 pixels, and in a mobile browser, mobile browsers can only accept images of different, obviously different browsers are different, but the WebKit browser on iOS can accept a 1024 image. So anything bigger than 1024 gets tiled as separate images. So radial gradients can be very dangerous. Like the little 2 eyes for the snowman was fine, but when you are taking a gradient, the whole thing gets drawn, even though only that part gets shown. So a linear gradient, no problem, use them all you want. Radial gradients, you need to make a decision. Any other questions? Okay, we'll give you a test. It's not really a test, but. And I'm going to leave the answers on the board. Okay. These are the answers to the questions. How did we make the snowflakes, how did we tell them to be different sizes? I'm actually going to go in order, so it makes it really easy for you guys. Should I make it harder? Should I get rid of the answers? Selectors. Good job. So we basically use structural selectors. And I showed you with a table how to use structural selectors. When I have these slides here, and they're all rounded, I didn't use structural selectors. But you'll see slide decks where that upper corner is pointy, and this one's rounded, and then the next one, the other corner is pointed. And what they do is they just say nth of type even. Make the left corner pointy. So, linear gradients. Where do we have linear gradients? The snowflakes. Arms. Eyes are radial. Yep, and we didn't really cover radial. Linear gradient, multiple background images. Okay, multiple background images. So I have basically, I also use background size. So if you guys are really interested in CSS and want to learn all of this stuff, and you don't have a social life, I'm going to go back to my deck here. And I'm going to increase the font size. Can you read that back there or not? Okay. I have a presentation on animation. Animating with snow is this one. Selectors, mobile performance, you just saw that one. Mobile web forms. Remember when I showed you the checkbox with the plus and I said all those size? That I'll cover in there. CSS gradients, we talked about that. And then this one right here, it's an 8-hour workshop where I go over all of this, but in deep detail. And all of the slides are kind of interactive, like these were, you know, where you can just move the slider. And then there's exercises within them. So if you go to the, let me just go back to the selectors talk. I'll just make it smaller. So in the selectors talk, you can do things like here, change this to white, and you can't see it anymore, or dashed, or let's just change it to red and dashed. So you can play with all of these things, and then if you get really bored, you can. I did this example on a Friday night. This right here is done using structural selectors. So it's just a table, and oops. Let's just go into its own page. It just basically says all the odd ones, starting with the 8th, every TD afterwards, make it red. And that's right here. This is the 8th cell, this is the 9th, and those are red. So, like, this is when you get really bored, but then you can do, you know, inane things like, oh, that was color. That's not what I want to change. I wanted to change this right here and make it black. So, that is it. Let me tell you who I am. Escape. Let me not tell you who I am, because we don't care. This is me. If you want to ask me questions, hit me up at Estelle VW. That's what I'm always checking. Actually, I'm completely addicted to it. It's bad. Thanks a lot for coming out.